Welcome everybody to our first developmental disability rounds of this current academic year, which will be every second Wednesday of every month starting this month. And this month, we are fortunate to have as the first presenter for the year, Dr. J. Bruce Morton. I've known, do you remember when we first met, Bruce?
Yeah, it was in the retreat for when Western decided to impose a moratorium on pediatric neuroimaging on
Right, and,
campus.
and that's right, with Dr. Paul Harding, I believe it
Yeah,
was. That's when
yeah,
you and I and Mark, I think, met the first time. That's right. That was like 2003 or 2004 or something like that.
something like that. Yeah.
Yep, a few years ago. And Bruce has always been very generous with his time to our rounds and has presented a number of times, which is fantastic. But it also, on top of that, most importantly, is an incredibly nice person. Dr. Morton is professor in the Department of Psychology at Western University and a principal investigator at Western's Brain and Mind Institute. Um, hang on a second here. Lost something. Sorry. Um, Dr. Morton completed his undergraduate degree at McMaster University and has a doctoral degree at the University of Toronto. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Denver before moving to London in 2002 as an assistant professor at the time, and he's gradually moved up the ranks and has been a full professor since 2017, I believe. Dr. Morton's nationally funded research concerns the development of executive functioning in children in childhood and integrates cross-cultural cognitive behavioral and neuroimaging methods. He has published in many major child development and cognitive neuroscience journals, including Developmental Neuroscience, Child Development, Journal of Neuroscience, and Neuroimage, and leads a very active research program. Equally importantly, perhaps more so, Bruce has two children, Bruce, or one?
Ooh.
Two kids at home, and he enjoys relaxing at home with them and his family and playing music. And I understand that Bruce is very big in the grindcore scene in London, Ontario. Is that correct, Bruce?
The grindcore?
Yes.
Um, not since I last checked my CV, but m maybe it's been updated recently without my knowledge.
Well, it could be. Well, I think we're all look forward to seeing you playing with that grindcore band somewhere downtown someday. Anyway, Dr. Morton is going to talk about sort of a very relevant sort of cultural question about different views in different countries to different mental health and neuropsychological problems. Bruce's talk today is going to be on the regional differences in the perception of ADHD-related behaviors in Canada and the Caribbean. So, Bruce, thank you again and welcome.
Well, thank you, Rob, for a very generous invitation. I always enjoy the opportunity talking with you and your group. And I'm just going to share my slides now. Maybe before you and Jason sort of duck out into the ether there, can you confirm that that everybody
Yeah.
can see that?
Yeah, it looks good.
That
Yep.
looks good. Okay, great. So with a bit of a backstory on this, uh, my primary focus, my research focus is, as Rob mentioned, the development of executive functioning and its association with age-related changes in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and cognitive control networks more broadly. But some number of years ago, I had a student, Ronald Geest, who approached me, and Ronald was born and raised in the South Caribbean in Trinidad, and he came to me with a very clear plan for his research. He was very interested in understanding how problems of executive functioning, specifically those related to ADHD, how those play out in the South Caribbean, and was hoping that I would have room in my lab to take him on. And he's a very, very special person, and he's got a terrific sense about how research plays an important role in applied aspects of psychology. And so I thought, this is somebody I really like to have in the lab. And so Ronald he completed his master's degree. He's now starting his PhD. He's a terrifically gifted young man, and I'm basically presenting the findings of his research program here. So most of the credit here is to Ronald and to our collaborator in Trinidad, Gerard Hutchinson, who's a pediatric psychiatrist and who's working firsthand with children and their families as they try to navigate a complex social environment in the Caribbean. So, so that's the backstory on how I got into this, and hopefully I can convince you that this is an interesting and relevant topic to thinking about the management of mental health issues, both in Canada and globally. Um, so no need for me to tell you what ADHD is, but as a starting point, I think it's important that we just sort of consider that ADHD is what would be considered a neurodevelopmental disorder. And from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, what is most salient about ADHD is pervasive inattentiveness, disorganization, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And this is a pattern of thinking and behavior that needs to be in place for quite a considerable period of time and to be evident across a number of different contexts, most especially school and home, and through the lens, of many caregivers. So it's something that has to be. It's not just it's not just a contextually dependent aberration in behavior, but it's something that's general across relationships and contexts. Now, the risk, of course, of leaving ADHD untreated is that affected individuals are at high risk for accidental self-injury. Ronald and Dr. Hutchinson in Trinidad have done research looking at elevated rates of ADHD amongst those involved in the criminal justice system in Trinidad. And indeed, you find that involvement in criminal activity is elevated amongst individuals with ADHD. The ADHD base rate, I suppose one way of putting it is the base rate of ADHD is higher amongst the criminally incarcerated in Trinidad and Tobago than it is in the wider population. Individuals are also at higher risk for unemployment and underemployment, where underemployment refers to a an occupation that doesn't take full advantage of the intellectual capabilities of the individual in question. So it's important that ADHD be identified and treated early on so as to avoid these untoward risks. Now, in Canada, the identification and treatment of ADHD is pretty good by all international standards. So there's a high propensity amongst teachers and parents to identify behaviors which would be considered risk indicators for ADHD. So these would be hyperactivity and inattentiveness. There's a high propensity amongst caregivers like teachers and parents to see these behaviors as potential signs of ADHD and to use that as a basis for bringing a child in for proper assessment. And as to why that is the case, it probably has something to do with the fact that most individuals in Canadian society are conversant in what we might call the medical model. So the idea of using medical concepts as a framework for understanding behavioral variability in our children. And indeed, most individuals in Canada are familiar, at least in general, with the concept of ADHD, and to that extent, can do a relatively decent job matching the risk behaviors associated with ADHD with this diagnostic label. However, whether this propensity to see hyperactivity and inattentiveness as a potential indicator of ADHD, whether this holds for other regions of the world is not altogether clear. So if we turn, for example, to the Caribbean, which is a network of islands ranging from Cuba in the northwest all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago here in the southeast and along the coastal regions of Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and all the way up into Honduras and parts of Guatemala. That is a region of the world that is collectively referred to as the Caribbean. And it's well known, obviously, for its natural beauty, and it's for its warm and welcoming climate. And of course, it is a very much sought after destination for holidaymakers from North America and Europe. But for the people that actually live in the region, it's not altogether what we see in travel or travel magazines. In fact, much of the region continues to suffer under the burden of its colonial legacy, and that suffering comes in the form of widespread poverty and disease, a limited acquaintance with medical concepts, be they related to psychiatric issues or just more broadly, and a widespread mistrust in public institutions, be they related to justice, education, or medicine. And to try and put some of this into perspective, in 1962, when Jamaica earned its independence or won its independence from England, upwards of 80% of the population was illiterate. And to me, that was a really, really striking statistic because it really underscored the challenges to a nation that was embarking on the project of political and economic independence. What kind of a challenge confronted the first governments? Because how do you form a modern economy? How do you form a modern government when 80% of the people that are living in your country cannot read and write? And again, this is just one indication of the extent to which the region is impoverished compared to what we consider what our standards here in North America and Canada. But certainly, it's fair to say that many individuals living in this region continue to suffer the burden of its colonial legacy. So you think, okay, fair enough, but what implications does it have for ADHD? And I think it's particularly important in part because ADHD remains a psychiatric disorder which is diagnosed primarily uh, through consultation by the diagnostician with teachers and parents that are in that child's life, and it's through this uh, dialogue between the diagnostician and these individuals that the diagnostician gains evidence uh, for the consistency of these risk behaviors, and then uses that information to arrive at a diagnosis. So what's important though is in setting that whole assessment process into motion, what's important is that parents and teachers who are responsible for bringing that child to the attention of a diagnostician, that they are flagging these risk behaviors as indicative of a diagnosable medical condition rather than something else, something not medical, something that's not psychological, something that may be disciplinary or a problem of the character of the individual child. So um, in a region that is has marked poverty and limited acquaintance with medical concepts, there is a risk then that these behaviors, which are indicative of the need for assessment, are overlooked and attributed to other underlying causes. So our research questions then in setting out was simply to compare uh, how parents and teachers in Canada, what they know and what their attitudes are towards ADHD, and how knowledge and attitudes amongst Canadian parents and teachers compare with the knowledge and attitudes of parents and teachers from the Caribbean, and looking particularly at ADHD. And as you'll see, we touch a little bit on mental health issues more broadly, but our focus here really is on ADHD. And the second thing is that compared to Canadian parents and teachers, how do Caribbean parents and teachers perceive ADHD related behavior? So by ADHD related behavior, I mean the behaviors that are normally considered um, indicative of risk for ADHD, hyperactivity, inattentiveness, impulsiveness. So our methods were as follows. So we had altogether 177 parents and teachers from Canada, so 65 teachers and 112 parents, and 203 participants from Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago is an island in the chain of the Caribbean islands, all the way the very sort of southeast extreme of the chain, immediately adjacent to Venezuela. And from that island, we had 55 teachers and 148 parents. And to measure attitudes, we had two different scales. Well, we had a scale to measure attitudes. The scale is intended to measure the how favorably disposed or positively disposed individuals are to the notion or to the an individual having ADHD. So these are individual items, and each of these 25 items, the participant just indicated whether or not they agreed or disagreed on a 5-point Likert scale with the items. So items included like ADHD is a valid diagnosis, ADHD is an excuse for children to misbehave, ADHD is diagnosed too often, et cetera, et cetera. And altogether, there were 25 of those items. There was also a knowledge survey, a series of 26 true-false questions. Again, what we're trying to do is just target knowledge about ADHD as as a developmental disorder, neurodevelopmental disorder. So there are a greater number of boys than girls with ADHD, true or false. There are approximately 1 in 3 children in every classroom with a diagnosis of ADHD, true or false. If medication is prescribed, educational interventions are often unnecessary, true, false, or don't know. These items were adopted from, or the instruments were adopted from instruments developed originally by Cost and Scudo, and they were adopted, the Trinidad and Tobago versions were adopted and validated for use in the Caribbean by USEF in 2015. So to look at the perception of ADHD behaviors themselves, we used a vignette methodology. So altogether in the study, there were 4 different vignettes, and each vignette described the behavior of a 10-year-old boy. And in one vignette, the 10-year-old boy, the behavior of that 10-year-old boy was, the description was very much like that of a child with the ADHD combined hyperactive inattentive symptoms. Then there was another vignette, again, 10-year-old boy, but this time the behavior of the child was the ADHD inattentive behavior pattern. There was a 4th vignette describing a child who had experienced a traumatic event and then was exhibiting behaviors and emotions likened to PTSD. And a 4th, a child was the victim of bullying and social exclusion and was also evidencing behaviors and emotions commensurate with that social experience. So there were 4 of these vignettes, and following each vignette, participants were, let me just give you a feel for what the vignette is like so that you have a sense about what's in the vignette and what is not in the vignette. So this is a sample vignette. This is of the child with the combined ADHD, So you've just been contacted by the teacher of your 10-year-old son. She informs you that he's been behaving disruptively in the classroom. He uses his pencils and desk as a drum set. He tends to blurt out answers without raising his hand, becomes frustrated when he has to wait his turn, doesn't appear to be rude or disrespectful. It's just he can't help himself. And at home, your son's older sister complains that he's been showing similar behavior at home for at least 3 years. So the vignette provides all the key behaviors that would flag ADHD, the combined ADHD diagnosis, flag that as, or provides all the features that, again, would put that child potentially at risk for the combined ADHD, but in nowhere does it say, it's not like the child has ADHD. So we provide a description of the behaviors, but without providing any of the diagnostic labels. Following each of the vignettes, then, the participants are asked a series of questions. The first question pertains to how urgent the participant feels this child requires assistance of some kind. Is this a problem that deserves attention or not? Then there are 5 questions that look to see the extent to which the participant attributes the observed behavior to one of 5 different non-medical underlying factors. So to what extent does the participant attribute the observed pattern behavior to a lack of motivation on the part of the child, or a lack of academic potential, or a need for discipline, or as a consequence of some economic hardship that might be impacting the child and their family, or some sort of a spiritual condition? As well, there are 2 final questions that ask the participants to report on how much they attribute the observed pattern and behaviors to an underlying psychological or medical condition. So what we're looking for across, especially the last 7 items, is to look to see what underlying factor the participant is attributing the observed behaviors that are portrayed in the vignettes. And for each of these items, the participant indicates on a 5-point Likert scale whether they strongly disagree or strongly agree that the observed behavior can be attributed, for example, to motivation, a problem of motivation. So I think that's fairly clear how we're using the vignette procedure to gather data concerning regional differences in the perception of ADHD-related behaviors. Okay, so all of this was packaged together in a like an online survey, which participants could complete on their cell phone. So following a link, they were provided with a welcome to the study page, where if they wanted to learn more about the study through the letter of information, they could follow links to get the letter of information and complete the consent. And then, having consented to this, they would indicate through the demographic survey whether they were a teacher or a parent. If they were a teacher, they were steered to versions of the vignette that were tailored to teachers. So rather than saying this is your son, the vignette would say this is a student in your class. If the participant indicated they were a parent but not a teacher, the vignettes were identical except for the opening sentence of the narrative in the vignette. So then they would receive the vignettes, so they would read through the vignettes, and following each vignette, they would then be asked these 8 questions concerning the urgency and then the attribution around the underlying cause of the observed behaviors. So to analyze the resulting behaviors, to look at regional differences in knowledge and attitudes, we just tested for country differences using standard parametric tests. But to look for regional differences in the perceptions of ADHD-related behaviors that came out of the vignette method, we used multi-level modeling. And the reason we did that is that the individual items and vignettes are not independent, because the same individual is responding to all questions for all vignettes. And moreover, we have a nesting of the individual within country as well. So what we did in this to analyze this is we use multi-level modeling, where each of the questions was modeled as a separate dependent variable. And within each of those multi-level models, we then had vignettes nested within the question, And then we included the country variable as a moderator. And then following those models, we then modeled the data again, adding knowledge and attitudes as covariates in the analysis. So that's how we analyze the data. And in all of the analysis, I'm going to report all of the p-values that we're reporting have been corrected for multiple comparisons using Bonferroni's procedure. Okay, so let's take a look at what we found. So starting first with regional differences in knowledge and attitudes. Here on the left in the gray bars are the results from the teachers and parents in Canada. So the very leftmost bar here, T, are the teachers, and immediately adjacent to that on the right are the parents. And in the blue bars on the right are the teachers here and the parents here, teachers on the left, parents on the right, from Trinidad and Tobago. And yes, there were regional differences. Sorry, there were differences between Canada and Trinidad, but they were not that pronounced, and there were no differences in attitudes towards teachers or attitudes towards ADHD amongst teachers and parents, um, which which allowed well, which meant that we treated in the analysis moving forward, we actually combined teachers and parents together because there was no difference either in knowledge and attitudes or or sorry, there were no difference between the teachers and the parents on attitudes or in knowledge. In any case, here, if we look now to knowledge of ADHD, we can see a very pronounced regional difference in knowledge of ADHD. Again, Canada is on the left in the gray bars. Trinidad and Tobago is on the right in the blue bars. And you can clearly see that knowledge of ADHD is higher amongst participants from Canada than it is from participants in Trinidad and Tobago. This is true even though to become a teacher in Trinidad, you actually have to get more university education than you do in Canada. Teachers in Trinidad have master's degrees, whereas teachers in Canada do not uniformly have degrees. You're required to have an undergraduate degree. Some teachers in Canada do have graduate degrees, but that's not a requirement of the profession, unlike in Trinidad. So these differences in knowledge between teachers or between especially teachers in Trinidad and teachers in Canada is quite pronounced and is occurring in spite of the fact that teachers in Trinidad are very, very highly educated. Okay, so this now looking at regional differences in perceived urgency. If we just average across all four vignettes and we look at regional differences in perceived urgency with Canada in gray, Trinidad in blue. Again, there's no difference in the perception of urgency. Again, there's some small differences amongst, well, with regards to the perceived urgency of behaviors associated with a trauma vignette. In Canada, amongst the Canadian participants, they felt that the behaviors portrayed in that vignette indicated greater urgency for action than did the participants from Trinidad. But again, for the most part, things look pretty similar here. So we're going to turn now to
Bruce, it looks like you might have muted yourself.
there we are. Yeah, I think you can hear me now. No?
Yeah, I got you.
Great. Okay. So now let's take a look at regional differences in these attributions about the underlying causes of the behaviors portrayed in the vignettes. And this is the reason okay, here we go. So we again have the vignettes listed here in a column on the left. And so looking first at lack of motivation. So anytime we see a positive value here, this indicates this is a slope estimate that comes out of the multi-level model. Canada in this analysis has been coded as 0. Trinidad has been coded as a 1. So that slope simply indicates that amongst the parents and teachers in Trinidad, there was a stronger endorsement of lack of motivation uh, as an attribution for the ADHD inattentive behaviors. Similarly, there is a stronger attribution of lack of motivation for the behaviors as a cause underlying the trauma and the bullying behaviors. So it seems that lack of motivation is a non-medicalized attribution. So by non-medicalized, I mean the attribution is to a non-medical related underlying cause. But lack of motivation is not specifically, it's not an attribution that's specific to ADHD. It's something that is observed across trauma and bullying as well. If we look at academic potential, again, the attributions for lack of academic potential were stronger amongst participants from Trinidad and Tobago than they were for Canada, but only for the vignette that portrayed trauma. With respect to disciplinary issue, however, it looks as though we have something here that's quite specific to ADHD. So both with respect to the vignette where that portrays a child with the ADHD inattentive type and the combined, participants from Trinidad and Tobago are more strongly endorsing disciplinary issue as an attribution for the observed behavior. That's not observed for trauma or for bullying. Financial hardship came up as a very strong, again, indicator for trauma, but for none of the other three vignettes. And interestingly, spiritual condition or spiritual interpretation of the behavior was the only dependent variable that we actually saw stronger attributions amongst the Canadian compared to the Trinidad and Tobagoan participants, and that was only evident for trauma. And then amongst the medical attributions, so to the extent to which the observed behaviors were attributed to an underlying psychological or medical problem, there were no significant country differences there. So then summarizing then across all of the results here, we see that with regards to lack of motivation, we see that that is an attribution that is much more strongly endorsed by participants from the South Caribbean than it is amongst participants from Canada to explain not only behaviors indicative of risk for ADHD, but behaviors linked to mental health problems more broadly. There is also attributions, though, that seem to pull specifically for ADHD, and those concern discipline. So amongst the individuals from Trinidad and Tobago, South Caribbean, those individuals more strongly endorsed discipline as an explanation for ADHD behaviors than did participants from Canada, but that did not generalize to the other two vignettes. Okay, so the last thing that we wanted to do in a multi-level modeling then was to see to what extent these country differences in attributing ADHD to lack of motivation and disciplinary issues, to what extent were these attributable to country differences in knowledge of ADHD? So you may recall from the outset of the talk that attitudes towards ADHD were relatively comparable amongst participants from Canada and Trinidad. But there was a marked difference in the knowledge about ADHD. So if we control for those regional differences in knowledge, what happens to these country differences in the pattern of attributions? And they shrink so that they're no longer significant. One thing that needs to be done in this analysis, of course, is to test whether or not this change in the strength of those country effects, that change is statistically meaningful or not. But clearly, the controlling for country differences in knowledge of ADHD appears to be attenuating the extent to which there are country differences or regional differences in the attribution of ADHD behavior to underlying lack of motivation or to problems of discipline. Okay, so just going to reiterate the main findings here. So our research questions were that compared to Canadian parents and teachers, how knowledgeable are Caribbean parents and teachers about ADHD? And we did find that despite the fact that teachers from the South Caribbean are highly educated, they are considerably less knowledgeable about ADHD than our parents and teachers from Canada. Second, the second research was question concerned whether compared to Canadian parents and teachers, whether Caribbean parents and teachers perceive ADHD-related behaviors in a similar way. Do they attribute these observed behaviors to the same set of underlying causes with the same in the same way? And the answer to that question was no. There's some indication there that for lack of motivation and in particular problems of discipline seem to be preferred. Well, those are the two underlying causes that individuals from the South Caribbean are more likely to endorse as an explanation for these observed behaviors compared to parents and teachers from Canada. So lack of motivation and problems of child indiscipline figure as an important distinction in terms of the interpretation of what we would consider risk behaviors for ADHD. So what are the larger implications? Well, we're trying to make statements about regional differences, but currently we have a very, very small sample of individuals from Canada with a compared to a very small sample of individuals from one country of a much wider region. So one priority moving forward is to see to what extent what was true in the comparison of the Canadian and Trinidadian samples in the current study, to what extent are those samples representative of broader regional differences, or whether these were something specific, hopefully not just to the samples that we included in the study, but specific perhaps to just Canada versus Trinidad. So that's one question that we have moving forward. And which we will be addressing in follow-up research. Another very, again, I like to think of it as a low-hanging fruit that comes out of this is that, I mean, to the extent that that these behaviors, which we would consider risk factors for ADHD and would warrant an appointment with a diagnostician, are being attributed to a lack of motivation and problems of discipline, to the extent that we can change the strength of those attributions, or that they're linked in some way to how knowledgeable people are about ADHD, it seems one very simple, promising intervention would be to provide parents and teachers in the region with more factual knowledge about ADHD as a diagnosable medical condition that is, although based on the perception of behaviors, is believed to be at least rooted in the neurobiology of the individual child. So providing people with some basic information may be enough to change the profile of attributions away from things like indiscipline and lack of effort and towards things that are more aligned with what we know to be true about the underlying causes of ADHD. I have some further thoughts on that, but we can return to that in the discussion. Um, the other thing is that I think that these differences in the perception of the underlying causes of ADHD-related behaviors may have some relation to differences in underlying prevalence rates or regional differences in prevalence rates. So, um, uh, prevalence rates, certainly amongst African Americans, even in the United States, is lower than it is amongst Hispanics and Caucasians, and that could be a function of not having sufficient funds available to actually go and visit a diagnostician and have a proper assessment done. But even then, when you control for differences in disposable income, the prevalence amongst Black individuals in even in North America is lower than it is for Hispanics and for Caucasians. With respect to prevalence rates in Trinidad, there simply has not been an epidemiological based study that provides an estimate of prevalence, but regional, comparisons within the region would suggest that prevalence is lower. And again, it's interesting to consider the possibility that possibly lower prevalence rates is perhaps connected in part to differences in the perception of these behaviors themselves. So if teachers and parents are less likely to see these behaviors as indicative of a diagnosable psychiatric problem and more likely to consider these as problems of discipline, it seems to us likely to imagine that these kinds of kids are going to be less likely in the office of diagnostician than they would be if parents and teachers realize that those behaviors are indicative of a diagnosable disorder. It also raises interesting questions about the perception of ADHD amongst the Caribbean diaspora in Canada. So, needless to say, Canada is a very multicultural country, and we like to think about our, well, I mean, it's very interesting then to consider the possibility that within selected communities within the larger Canadian cultural mosaic, that there can be marked differences in the perception of these behaviors. And I think that's very relevant when we think about some of the challenges that confront children as they, with ADHD, as they try to secure the assistance that they require in order to navigate the challenges of life with ADHD, constantly a part of their lives. So, in any case, I just want to give a call out to the folks in my lab. So Ronald Auguste, who he does all the hard work and all the thinking on this. He was generous enough to lend me his slides for this talk, and then Erfan Zerenia and Amira Miden and Nagar Yazdi and to other folks who along the way have completed various honors undergraduate theses as part of this project, as well as support from our regional partners at the University of West Indies, and support through various federal funding agencies. So yeah, all of this wouldn't be possible without the assistance of those organizations and individuals. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to answering any of your questions you might have.
Thank you, Bruce. That was great and a really nice review and a really interesting question, I think. I have several questions, but and if other people have questions, please so put it in the chat or whatever, or raise your hand as Dr. Goldberg has done, and I will call on Ben in a second. But Bruce, I don't want to sound too cynical, but how widely used are medicines for ADHD in Trinidad and Tobago?
Limited, in part because it's very hard for the pharmacies to secure a consistent supply of medicines, and there's only one type of, to the extent that you can even secure a supply from the international market, they can only get one pharmaceutical. So the range of pharmaceutical options are limited, and you can't rely on the supply chain.
So that leads to my next question, because I think that clearly diagnostic trends at some level are driven by drug company advertising and their sort of detail people. And so do you think it's possible there's less known about ADHD in Trinidad and Tobago because treatments aren't available and drug companies are probably just not as interested?
Well, I mean, I could turn the question around and say, do you think that the reason why individuals in Canada are familiar with a biomedical explanation for ADHD is because pharmaceutical companies advertise their products to Canadian consumers? I mean, I think we know more about ADHD than just what we learned through the, pharmaceutical marketing.
But I think there's also a lot written in magazines and journals and sort of lay journals, magazines. And I think that they also, I think pharmaceutical companies have become much better at sort of directing their efforts towards primary care physicians who write most prescriptions far more than any specialist. And I think I would like to believe that it's not influenced like that by pharmaceutical companies, but I think it'd be a bit naive to say that. And I think we have some example, I think in Scandinavia, where up until a certain point in time, somewhere in the last 25, 30 years, stimulants were not available at all. And I think the rate of ADHD increased there after they were available. And I mean, there may be other factors at play, but I certainly wonder about that. Um,
Yeah, well, again, I mean, that's a really, really, really like it's a really, really tricky issue because in the absence, I could ask you this again I'm not a practicing psychiatrist, you are. But so I could ask you as a practicing psychiatrist, I mean, to what extent do medical concepts really have utility in a diagnostic theater if you have no available treatments? I mean, it seems to me one kind of goes along with the other. We have these diagnostic categories to the extent that you have treatments available to offer should that diagnosis be made.
well, I would say for intellectual disabilities, we don't have any treatments per se, right? I mean, we could treat the behavior problems people might have. And I would argue the same with autism. And I think probably a number of things. I mean, I don't know outside of mental health things, but, and I can certainly tell you that uh, I think the same thing happened with social phobia, right? Where drug companies are always looking for a new indication for treatments. And I think they had sort of pushed it. And I think as it gets diagnosed more, then it ends up in publications. People read about it. They see ads, not so much in Canada, but in the United States, we see ads all the time for Concerta or whatever other stimulant about, people should contact their physician about it. And I don't know how much it drives it. That's my question in part. I think that I would like to say not at all, I say, but I think it might be a bit naive on my part. But at the same time, I don't have any definitive evidence for that. It's just my own impression, which could be completely erroneous.
Yeah, I mean it's a really interesting question. I guess not being quite as cynical, I'd have to think that um people in Canada, like I find it easier to spin the question around rather than thinking is it that because the pharmaceuticals are not readily available as a treatment modality in Trinidad and Tobago, that the pharmaceutical companies are advertising less and people are less knowledgeable. I mean, it's easier for me to kind of think, okay, well, in Canada where we are knowledgeable, are we getting our knowledge from somewhere other than pharma? And I think the answer would be yes.
But
Maybe again,
but I think though
naive.
but I wonder too if that's because there is more diagnosis because there is more treatment and there's more availability of information about that. And so how much does that drive that sort of question? And and I don't, because even when you said, that we have in North America, we tend to, most people are aware of the medical model, but how do we become aware of all sorts of things? And I would bet that advertising in the United States in particular, where they have all this short description of what a medication can do and then a lengthy description of all the side effects, but we see those ads here, and I think that has to drive some things also. Again, the
Yeah.
number of people I've had call my office, and I think some of the pediatricians here would attest also, just in the last 2 weeks about leucovorin because Robert F. Kennedy Jr. talked about it. And I think that otherwise people would have no knowledge at all. Now, from drug companies, well, I guess they are advertising direct to people now, aren't they? So,
Yeah.
but we'll see if anybody else has any thoughts about that, or maybe I'm just off base completely. But Dr. Goldberg, let me mute you, or sorry, no, unmute you, not mute you. Actually, I think Jason, you might have to do that.
Got it.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, a fascinating study. I'm curious to be able to compare Canadian families to Caribbean families. So the question is, did you compare them in terms of socioeconomic and religious levels? In other words, and educational level. Was the educational level of the Canadian families equal to the educational level of the Caribbean families? Was the religious affiliation of the Canadian family, because spare the rod, spoil the child. They're more likely to be, if they're more religious, they're more likely to be disciplinary. So, how comparable were they?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, with regards to the teachers actually have more years of formal education in the Caribbean than they do in Canada, and that's because the professional requirements in Trinidad are such that teachers have to have at least a master's degree in order to become a teacher. So if you define, level of education as a marker of socioeconomic status, things are slightly higher in Trinidad than they are in Canada, at least amongst the teachers. Like with regards to things like income, it gets really, really tricky, in part because, obviously, if you just look at raw income values, correcting obviously for the difference in currency, your average Canadian and the Canadians in our sample are going to have a larger disposable income than in Trinidad. But the samples were made equivalent with respect to purchasing parity. So like regardless of how much money you actually have, how much can you purchase with that money? And the samples were made to be comparable with on those levels. With regards to religion, that's a good question. I would have to defer to Ronald. I know he's on this call, but he's not able to participate in this discussion. Maybe that's something that Jason might be able to help us with. But those are things that that I think we looked at, but I can't speak in detail about the differences in the samples. But those are they're very relevant concerns. Like regional differences are really, really complicated in part because there's one aspect of the region that you're interested in comparing, which may be, for example, how medicalized they are or how conversant they are in applying a medical model to the analysis of child behavior. But invariably what happens is that there are a whole bunch of other additional country differences that get, pulled along in that country comparison, and it makes any direct comparison very challenging. I think
So
Ronald.
Ronald, if you want to go ahead, Ronald, if you have anything to or what you would like to add.
Oh, sure. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. So, yes, what Dr. Bruce was saying was totally correct. We we didn't directly measure we didn't measure like religion or religiosity, right? But we use the purchasing power parity, so we were able to kind of have equivalence in that regard, but no direct measure of religiosity.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. There's a question or a comment in the Q&A from Anonymous. How likely, so a couple of things. How likely do you think that suggestions and treatment options offered will be used or taken into consideration in Trinidad and Tobago? And so the follow-up that was, that you mentioned that they aren't really open to colonialist suggestions, perhaps, and have a strong negative history that still continues. And so would any sort of attempt to suggest treatment be seen as colonialist at some level?
And that's a really, really interesting question. So, I think in part it comes from who it is that's doing the educating. So, and I think, Ronald, as an individual from the region, like if we decide to go ahead with an educational, like a collaboration with the Ministry of Education around the teacher education of ADHD, it would make no sense for me to go and do that, precisely because despite my best efforts and my good intentions, um, I think it could be construed as not colonialist per se, but kind of like a message from the outside. Um, I think that any effort in that regard then would have to come from Ronald and from our stakeholders in Trinidad and Tobago, to the extent that they feel that the evidence from this study would warrant that kind of an educational intervention. The other thing that I think is interesting too is that perhaps I kind of naively think, well, listen, if teachers in Trinidad are simply not that knowledgeable about ADHD, and they're more likely to attribute these behaviors to a lack of motivation and to problems of discipline, maybe all we need to do is teach them about ADHD, and those profile of attributions will change. But there's another part of me that kind of thinks, well, no, I mean, maybe these interventions will be unsuccessful precisely because people are attached to the way they perceive these behaviors, and they're resistant to these medical concepts in the same way because they see these medical concepts as sort of being part and parcel with colonialism. And so there's perhaps an anti-colonialist or decolonizing attitude towards efforts to educate around the medicalization of child behavior. Again, I think that it's a really fascinating question, and it's a touchstone that I'd like to revisit in future studies. Ronald, I think, should really speak to this issue, though, if I may.
Yeah, sure, sure. So I think the who the messenger is and how that messenger is received could also vary based on the particular audience as well, right? Because you can find some individuals who are more receptive to something foreign being equal to something better, and you could also find individuals who think of it as this is from somebody foreign, so it's being imposed on me, so I reject it. So it could be a bit of a mixed bag where that's concerned. And I also think the framing of the message itself too would be critical. So for example, even if we wanna promote these behaviors are indicative or can be indicative of ADHD as opposed to indiscipline, we may not want to say this is not indiscipline. We may not want to try to say things or do things to bring across you're wrong. More like this is a means to achieve some of the ends that you're looking at. So by viewing this in this way, your child could get the help necessary to perform better in school, because we know like the academic performance and the test scores are extremely important. But this is a way to help your child engage in the classroom in a more disciplined way. So it's kind of like not trying to activate some of the resisting types of attitudes, but to kind of marry the information into some of the like preset structures of interpretation in some sense.
Thank you. So, Dr. Martinez Trujillo, if you want to unmute yourself, you're free to speak. And I don't know, Julio, if you want to talk about a Cuban experience with ADHD, but if you do, it'd be interesting to hear.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, for the wonderful talk. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, the experience that I had is that there were several clinics in Havana that they were trying to, uh, time when I was there, trying to diagnose ADHD by looking at EEG patterns and things like that. And there were several findings that they were, which was easy because the system has this whole network of neurophysiology labs, and they were doing EEG in a lot of teenagers, people. So it was a big resource. I don't know if Bruce, if you got in touch with Mitchell Valdez and the guys, but one thing that I wanted to ask you is because in the biology of ADHD now, everyone went into doing genomics and try to quantify genotypes and there are several genes that they have been associated to ADHD, like dopamine, for example, signaling genes. And my question was, there are a couple of factors here, like whether the samples of Canadian kids and kids in Trinidad are comparable in terms of symptomatology, in terms of this kind of thing, because ADHD is a very diverse entity, right? And you have more hyperactivity, less. I mean, Rob is probably the best person to look into that. But my question is that because the perception probably is linked to the symptomatology, and the symptomatology is linked to the genetics, and maybe also linked to other factors, like, for example, prematurity. So how are premature births in the population that you see relative to the population in Canada? In Canada, I don't know how it's in Trinidad because I don't know the healthcare system, but here you can have maybe a large proportion of these kids, or at least is more than in the normal population. They are preterm births, and in this case, and that makes the comparison very complicated. And if you add into that, if there is a genetic component and the parents, for example, tend to have some personalities that they are similar in that case, or some trends, it makes even more complicated the whole thing. So, and I understand you have this study, that you have this view. My question is, how much do you think that you can get deeper into that and say, listen, the prevalence of those dopaminergic genes in the populations is the same? It doesn't matter because the entity maybe is robust to that and is similar across countries. So maybe we have a different landscape here in Canada. That's my question to you.
Yeah, so again, thank you, Julio, for a really interesting question. I always love the opportunity to chat with you about anything related to neuroscience and development. And so I appreciate your question. So yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, in this study, the vignettes that were administered to the Canadian teachers and parents were virtually indistinguishable from the vignettes, with the exception, yeah, they were indistinguishable. We made them absolutely equivalent. So there's no child difference that we've introduced into the design. But the question that you ask is, well, maybe if there are regional differences in the way ADHD is expressed, that there may be regional differences in the perception of these behaviors themselves.
Right.
And that's a very interesting question that I haven't really thought about. And I'm not really sure. Again, I kind of feel like I need to defer to Ronald on this one to really to think about it. But I think my hunch would be that there would be interregional stability, at least in the profile of behaviors that are associated with the risk for ADHD. As to regional differences in even if you do like a GWAS-based polygenetic risk score, if you take a random sample of kids from Trinidad and do GWAS and do a polygenic risk score there, again, I have absolutely no idea what to anticipate in terms of what regional differences in the polygenic risk score would be for ADHD. No idea. To be honest, there's no basis even for comparing just baseline prevalence because there are insufficient resources in the region even to know how many kids are out there. So I think that these are really interesting and important questions, but we currently don't have the resources really to speak meaningfully to them. That would be my hunch, but I could be wrong. Ronald
But
probably would know more than me.
if I could just say, Bruce, also, I think it's, Julio's question about perception is huge because our diagnoses are generally based on parent report and teacher report, not on child report, especially in younger kids. So perception is going to play a huge role in that, obviously, and how
Yep.
we change that before. So you're right, doing cross-cultural stuff would be very, very difficult without having some way of sort of, I don't know, equating perceptions, but making sure they're similar in some ways. Because if everything is attributed to behavior, then that's going to change everything. The other thing I wonder about a bit too, I must say, is that so Claire Mitchell is a pediatrician who used to work at CPRI. She's in private practice now, but every year for I don't know how long, probably I'm going to say the last decade, but that's a complete guess, has been going at least annually, if not twice a year, to Guyana to do sort of medical outreach out in these sort of more outlying areas. And a few years ago, I went with her and a group of people, and I did a lecture for some of the medical pediatrics residents at in Georgetown. And they were saying that basically, at the time, I don't think there were any child psychiatrists in Guyana at all. And so that's where I think changing diagnostic practice is going to be hard because it would often go to adult psychiatrists or things like that who wouldn't necessarily know about ADHD in the same way. And so therefore getting diagnoses or even changing this would be incredibly difficult, I think, because don't have that sort of critical mass of people or psychologists either, frankly, for that matter.
Yeah, and I mean, in the absence of a body of again, it's really tricky, but in the absence of a body of kids in a region who've got the label and another body of kids from a different region that have the same label, I mean, to do what you're suggesting, Julio, would be to see whether or not there's a difference in the kind of the profiles that these kids present behaviorally. Uh, as important as that would be to do, I think it would be very challenging given the fact that even like resources available for doing basic diagnoses are massively deficient in the region compared to what we would be used to here in Canada.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm,
sorry,
maybe
Bruce,
I'm
go ahead.
missing your point, Julio.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
And then there's a question here from Pamela Cushing, who's in disability studies at Western. I'm not sure, Pam, if you still are the chair of disability studies, to be honest with you. But her question was, and perhaps again more for Ronald. I hate to rope you in like that, Ronald, but could you comment on the Trinidadian sort of cultural meaning of a label, such as having a disability or mental health, versus it being seen as a quote disciplinary matter? So what is the view of labels and diagnostic labels and things that? And Pam wondered if the former, so seeing it as a disability or mental health problem, would be seen as almost worse in some areas in the Caribbean, given sort of skepticism about mental health labels and diagnoses.
Uh, right. So I guess it would be difficult to make a blanket statement about diagnostic labels in general. It would really vary depending on what the particular diagnostic label is. So, like for instance, things like psychotic disorders in the Caribbean, or at least in Trinidad, we might just colloquially just lump all of those things into mad. Like that's just a mad person. With ADHD, it could be a little bit more nuanced than that. So you could meet resistance or stigmatization toward the label, but in some fairly special cases, you could find people gravitating towards wanting that diagnostic label for themselves or for their child. So again, like in the education system, it's very much based on how do we perform in the first instance in primary education, the national exams, and then for secondary, how do we perform in the regional exams? So in those instances, you might actually find students, parents, and teachers wanting children to get the diagnosis because it would allow them to get the academic accommodations and the student support services and those kind of things. So around, let's say, children around the ages of 10, 11, 12, when you're actually doing those national exams or preparing for it, like when it's in kind of like a high gear for those, you could find much more of an acceptance for particular diagnostic labels, especially if they relate to educational academic performance. Similarly, if it's around the ages of, let's say, 14, 15, 16, when the next set of like regional exams come around. So it would be a bit of a mixed bag in terms of how the diagnostic labels are received.
Yeah, because I think what we see here, and there was a point made about that perhaps because there are treatments available here, but also there are accommodations that parents will often seek out diagnoses for their kids as an explanation for why their kids aren't doing so well. And again, the view of, I guess, stigmatizing has changed dramatically, I think, in the last 20, 30, 40 years. When I was in kindergarten and grade one, there was a boy I knew, and he had ADHD. We're talking about the early 1970s at this point in time. And so there really weren't any treatments available. And I think that people didn't want him coming over because he was exhausting for everybody, and ended up in in trouble with the law as he got older and things. And so we know and so I think it probably was more stigmatized at that point in time. And I think the question was asked about stigma is really interesting also because I think we know that in some, at least historically, in East Asian countries, I think the view of mental health problems was seen as sort of very not desirable. My understanding at one point in time was that a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder was preferable to a diagnosis of autism in South Korea, even though reactive attachment disorder pretty clearly implies negligent parenting, and autism doesn't, and yet it was seen as less stigmatizing and more desirable, I suppose, in one way or the other. Are there other questions or comments people have? I mean, it's obviously a really fascinating question, and I think it goes to the heart of how we perceive and diagnose mental health problems at some level. That often has to be based on, well, it's all based on observable behavior, which is less than ideal. It's the best that we have, but it's less than ideal, almost certainly. Julio, were you going to say something?
No, thank you. I think that I just remained unmuted. Thank you.
Okay. So Bruce, this was fantastic. Obviously, I sort of created a lot of discussion, and Ronald, also I appreciate for you your willingness to be drafted into the discussion. But I think, Bruce, I'd love to talk to you more about this and what your plans are around educational stuff, because it just sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, I look forward to it. It was, yeah, I welcome the opportunity, Rob.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. And Ronald, thank you as well. So just a couple of updates, please, everybody fill in their evaluations. And I think, Jason, is it fair to say people will get a link to do their
Yeah, I will
evaluation?
email everyone. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then after that, the credit for continuing education events. So just a couple other reminders. So from now until October 31st, application are being accepted for the annual C. Kingsley Allison Research Grant, which provides funds up to $9,000 for essentially pilot studies, really, but to support research focused on developmental disabilities, but defined fairly broadly. So it can be about epilepsy or executive functioning in people with developmental disabilities. And our website is fairly straightforward, ddp.uwo.ca, if people would like to look at that. And then our next rounds are on November the 12th, when I will be doing a talk entitled Aha, Maha, as in MAHA, or Recent Revelations About Autism and Its Cause. So that will be a month from, well, today, sort of, at 4 o'clock. Jason, was there anything else we need to say?
I think that's good.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us. And Bruce, thank you again for being so willing to do this time after time. I really appreciate it. And we shall be in touch. Yep. Okay. And thanks, Ronald. Bye, everybody.
No problem. Bye.
Yeah.